Ladies and gentlemen, Binal of America!
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Binal of America Audio with your host, Tim Binal.
Hello out there, my friends. This is Tim Binal of BinalofAmerica.com with the penultimate edition of BOAA Audio Season 4. I'll preview the interview you're about to hear with the iconic Budd Hopkins in just a moment. I want to throw out two plugs before we dive into the program. First, the next edition of BOAA Audio is, of course, the season finale of Season 4, and our guest is, if you haven't heard by now, the enigmatic and infamous John Lear. John Lear changed the face of ufology in the 1980s, much like this week's guest Budd Hopkins did, ironically enough, and we're going to talk to him all about that and a whole bunch of other stuff next week on the program. You definitely want to check out the season finale of BOAA Audio Season 4 with John Lear. It is going to be a must-hear edition of the program. The other thing I want to plug is something I've been working on here for the last year. We're really kicking it into high gear starting this week, and that is the Mass Paranormal Weekend. It is a convention of sorts, October 16th to 18th in Watertown, Massachusetts. First night is UFO show. It is awesome. The guests are Nick Redfern, Peter Robbins, Nancy Talbot, and John Horrigan. They're going to be talking about UFO crashes, the Rendlesham Forest, UFO incident, crop circles and psychic mediums, black helicopters, and the LA air raid of 1942. Then, on Saturday night, it is the Mass Monster Mash. Lauren Coleman, Nick Redfern, Jeff Belanger, and Chris Balzano talking about the abominable snowman, Chupacabra, White House ghosts and other haunted places, and the infamous Bridgewater Triangle. That's on Saturday night. Sunday afternoon, speaking of the infamous Bridgewater Triangle, it is the Mass Mystery Tour. That is a bus tour hitting some of the more notable locations within the Bridgewater Triangle for esoteric madness. Anyway, the event is Mass Paranormal Weekend, 2 nights and an afternoon event, reasonably priced, $25 for either of the nights, $35 for the bus tour. Reduced cost for people who buy tickets for multiple events. So, if you want to go to Friday and Saturday, you want to go to Saturday and Sunday, you want to go to all three, there's all kinds of discounts at the website. Let me give you the plug for the website, and then we're going to get cooking on this week's edition of BOAA Audio. The website is www.maparanormal.com. Wicked simple. maparanormal.com, all one word, or go to BOA. There's going to be links all over the place. This is really my first foray into the conference realm, and I hope folks come and check it out. I know we have listeners all over New England, and at the prices for this conference, you could actually swing this trip for a pretty reasonable amount and meet a lot of huge names. Nick Redfern, Peter Robbins, Lauren Coleman, Jeff Belanger. I mean, these are superstars, and we're bringing them to the Mass Paranormal Weekend. maparanormal.com. Check it out. There you go. That was the sales pitch. Now let's talk about this week's edition of BOAA Audio. I couldn't be happier with this episode. I was thrilled having Budd Hopkins on as a guest, then read his book, the recently published memoir, Art, Life, and UFOs, which recounts his remarkable and epic life, not just as the father of abduction research, but also as an acclaimed artist. As I mentioned to Budd when we started the interview, so many times when you're hearing him on an esoteric program, that art aspect of Budd Hopkins' life is criminally undersold. But here in this conversation, you're going to learn a lot about Budd Hopkins, the artist, as well as Budd Hopkins, the pioneering abduction researcher. In essence, we kind of split it in half. I'm hesitant to do the point-by-point preview because there's just so much stuff in here. It's really jam-packed with material. So the best way to put it is, first half is all about Budd's early life and accomplished career as an artist. You don't want to miss this, folks. I know this is an esoteric program. There's plenty of esoteric discussion weaved in there as we're talking about art with Budd Hopkins. So you don't want to miss this stuff. It is mind-blowing. Stick around for the art part. Don't fast forward to just UFOs. The UFO stuff, obviously, mind-blowing material with Budd Hopkins. All about some of the trends and the evolution of abduction research since Budd really broke the ground in the early 1980s. Plus a lot of discussion on ufology today and the problems facing the field of UFO studies. You definitely don't want to miss that. It is enlightening material from a true legend in the field of ufology. And I've already talked enough here about the interview. You're definitely going to want to listen to this one, so we're just going to dive in now to the bio part of the intro. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Budd Hopkins, allow me to provide you with a little background on it. Budd Hopkins is a world-renowned artist, author, and pioneer UFO abduction researcher. Having investigated well over 700 cases, he now heads the Intruders Foundation, a non-profit scientific research and support organization. Taken together, his 3 books, Missing Time, Intruders, and Witnessed, are widely regarded by researchers and skeptics alike as comprising the most influential series of books yet published on the abduction phenomenon. Let that sink in for a minute, folks. I mean, this is one of the all-time greats. These works, Hopkins' lectures, and his other presentations have been responsible for bringing a number of other noted researchers, such as David Jacobs, John Carpenter, Yvonne Smith, and John Mack, among others, into this extraordinary area of specialization. His documented discoveries have become the basis of most later abduction investigations and research. Hopkins' goal has always been to bring an objective, dispassionate, scientific intelligence to bear on the UFO abduction phenomenon. To this end, he founded the Intruders Foundation in 1989. IF is a non-profit organization devoted to research and public education concerning these extraordinary enigma. Despite its extremely controversial nature, Hopkins' research has received serious commentary in such mainstream publications as Time Magazine, Paris Match, The Washington Post, The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, Omni, People Magazine, and Cosmopolitan. He's been a guest on hundreds of television shows and radio programs, including Nightline, Good Morning America, The Today Show, The Oprah Winfrey Show, The Tonight Show, Charlie Rose, Larry King Live, 2020, 48 Hours, Unsolved Mysteries, Encounters, A Current Affair, Night Watch, The Late Show, Coast to Coast AM, Tom Snyder, National Public Radio, Voice of America, Armed Forces Radio, numerous BBC affiliates, and many other shows and forums. And now I'm proud to say he's appeared on BOA Audio. His website is www.intrudersfoundation.org. Pretty simple, both words, put them together, add a .org, intrudersfoundation.org. Check it out. And now, without any further ado, let's rock and roll. This interview was recorded on August 12th, 2009. Budd Hopkins, talking about art, life, and UFOs, a memoir, on the penultimate edition of BOA Audio, Season 4. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of All of America Audio. Usually I sort of build up to who the guest is, but I'll just start out and say our guest is the iconic Budd Hopkins, and it is just a thrill for me to be talking to him. Last night I just finished his new book, his memoir, Art, Life, and UFOs. I can't put this book over enough. It's outstanding. As many people know who've been listening to the program for a long time, I've been needling Stan Friedman for the last 2 years to write a memoir. So when this arrived in the mail, I nearly lost it because I was so excited to read it. And it's about time such an impact player in the world of esoterica wrote their story, and I just couldn't be happier with the book. Art, Life, and UFOs by Budd Hopkins is from Anomalous Books. Go out and get it right now, folks, because you're going to love it as much as I did. Just to give you a sort of a thumbnail look at what the book is, you know, Budd was born in 1931, stricken with polio as a child, had just some tumultuous years as a kid, moved to New York in the 1950s to become an artist, befriended, and really was a part of the famous abstract expressionist painting movement. Friends with Alger Hiss, almost fought Jack Kerouac once, introduced David Jacobs and John Mack to abduction research, had an infamous run-in with Shirley MacLaine and Carl Sagan. He's appeared on Oprah, Larry King, and many, many other huge TV shows. And, you know, the world of abduction research really began with Budd Hopkins. I'm sure there were people talking about it beforehand, but Budd really set the stage for it. He is the giant upon whose shoulders so many people in the world of esoterica stand. He's an icon. He's a Hall of Famer, first ballot, no doubt about that, and a living legend. And it's just a huge thrill for me to be talking to him. As I said, I read the book last night. I felt like I spent the day with Budd Hopkins yesterday as I read the whole book. and I'm just so excited to be talking to him. Bud, welcome to Banal of America Audio. It's been a long time coming, but I'm really happy to have you here on the show.
Well, thank you. I don't know what I'd have to do besides tap dance to live up to an introduction like that. My gosh. But many thanks for all the wonderful things you just said.
Well, I meant it, Bud. I really did, and I just was so thrilled with the book, and I really hope people go out and get it. And I want to make a point here about the title, Art, Life, and UFOs, a Memoir. Just poignant and beautiful in a way, and kind of telling too, because there are a lot of people in the UFO field that if they were to write their memoirs, the book would be just titled UFOs is Life. so I think that you really encapsulate a lot of what I believe in too as well, that life is just a full spectrum of different things, and your life has been epic, and if I could achieve 10% of what you've done, I'd die a happy man. So to be able to talk to you now and really dig into this amazing life that you've put down into words here for everybody to experience is going to be great.
Well, thank you very much. And, of course, in a certain sense, I've been very lucky to have lived through some very dramatic times in history, in the art world, in the UFO world, and just in general American history. So,
of course.
Other people have not been so lucky who have been born perhaps 20 or 30 years later. So I have that advantage, I have to say.
That's true. And if someone's living under a rock somewhere they don't know, you're, of course, the author of the groundbreaking and iconic Missing Time, as well as Intruders, Witnessed, and Sight Unseen. And usually we start the interview with, a little bio background, but that's the whole gist of the interview here. So I guess to start the whole thing out, why a memoir? What made you decide to put down your life's work here into words?
Well, I think that essentially, as you hit a certain age, and I'm sure hit it hard at 78, so you kind of look back and think there's a lot of interesting stuff that's taken place over these 78 years, and things that I just don't want to have disappear. It's an awful thing to think that, when you go, you take with you so much richness that's occurred in your life with other people and so forth. So I decided to put it all together. I originally started this because my daughter, who was as a teenager years ago, said to me, amazingly, as we were walking along, she said, Dad, I don't think I know very much about you. And I was stunned because I thought I talked about myself more than most people. So at any rate, I thought I'd start writing, kind of memoir and family history and so forth, because part of what she said I thought applied to the fact that she didn't know too much about my family background. So as I was working on this over the years, and I've been at this off and on probably over a 10, 15-year period.
Oh, wow.
And what happened is I began to get more and more serious about it, and I began to decide to drop out the family stuff that wasn't going to be interesting to anybody who wasn't at least a second cousin of mine or something. So I would just kind of concentrate on the things that might be interesting for one reason or another to readers in general, whether they even knew about my UFO work and my art or not. And so it began the process. I began the process of paring down, and then as you do this over years, things pop into your mind. As a matter of fact, the little chapter, and it's arranged in terms of as you know, of little pieces which are sort of almost self-contained. And the piece that I wrote about, which was called Dodging Hits,
yes.
Which was my dealing with, when I was a very young man, with hits from various closeted gay men who I thought, of course, at least hoped to think were interested in my art, and that wasn't what they were interested in. So I suddenly thought about that. Gee, that's a whole collection of little incidents that I should put together, because in terms of social history, it lets people know today what it was like for these men who were very closeted and very subject to possible blackmail and so on in those days. It was a very tough time for them, and it was a very depressing time for me to find out that they weren't about to buy a painting or give me a show. They were interested in something else, sort of a casting couch thing. But when that popped into my mind, I thought, well, that's a whole other, piece of social history. And social history mixed with personal biography. Mm-hmm. So I put that together as one of the last sections in the book to have pop into memory. But the book, went that way with little bio sections of various people in the art world and in the UFO world. I have a piece on Allen Hynek and one on Lawrence Rockefeller and then one on John, of course.
Yeah.
So it was just an accumulation of these little sort of nuggets of memory, which I thought would be interesting to people at large.
Absolutely, yeah. The book is fascinating. I also want to give you credit, too, here, because, you do tell some stories in there that, were embarrassing or humiliating or difficult for you, and that's really, I guess, shows your wisdom to include those in the book. I don't know, maybe I'm young, I'm only 30, so I can't imagine ever including any of my embarrassing stories in a memoir, but I got to take my hat off to you, because some of them, the story of your 10-year birthday party, the fight there, and the earliest memory of you on the cart when you were stricken with polio. I mean, you really had to plumb the depths there, and I just, amazing stuff.
Some of that was, has lived with me very, very strongly for years.
I'm sure, yeah.
Humiliations never go away. That's one of the great life experiences that you're going to have at your dying day, memories of humiliations.
That's for sure. Like, as I said, art, life, and UFOs, and I feel like to the people in ufology and the people who have an interest in the paranormal and stuff like that, your career as an artist is almost undersold to the point where, it's always an afterthought to these people. And that's not the case with this book. And for the people who pick it up, read the first half of the book, because that's as fascinating and compelling and remarkable as the second half UFO stuff. So anybody who starts at the UFO material is a fool, and they should start at the beginning of the book, because I was completely blown away by that, and that's where we're going to start today in this conversation, with the beginning and the art period as well as the UFO stuff, because we're not going to undersell that. Just to sort of start out, I guess, in your artistic career, one observation you make, which really sort of struck me as a fascinating sort of observation, you say 3 major areas where nature bestows luscious color in such abundance: flowers, tropical fish, and birds. That's the eye of the artist, I guess you could say.
Well, when I was very, very little and had polio, I began sort of concentrating my life on what was about as far away from me as I could reach with my arms, since I couldn't walk. And so I began scribbling and drawing and making things as a very little kid. And when I finally went to a preschool, practically daycare thing, when I was a little more mobile, well, there was a teacher there who had everybody drawing and painting and making little sloppy things. And I remember drawing or copying pictures of tropical fish and just being totally fascinated. And I couldn't remember whether there was actually a tropical fish tank there or whether I was just shown pictures, but they were so beautiful. And as a little kid, you like something that's bright and that's actually alive, and the idea of these little fish fascinated me, and I began to seek them out whenever I could, go to aquariums and so on. And I think that the strange delicacy of color of tropical fish probably had something to do with my thinking about color when I began painting more seriously. As I mentioned in the book, I can hardly pass a pet shop without going in and look at the tank, just to look at the fish. So those sorts of observations. I mean, if you end up a painter, those sorts of observations are really feeding into what is coming out of you on the canvas. And I suppose those images of the colors that I was seeing with the tropical fish fed into what I was making as art, along with the idea that my father had taken the family to the New York World's Fair in 1940, believe it or not. And I was just totally fascinated. I would have been 9 years old by the architecture and these wild sort of modernistic curves and points and spirals and so forth. And I've since really thought that some of the Guardian paintings that I have been doing for a number of years were definitely influenced just in their shapes and their construction by some of the modern buildings that I saw at the World's Fair. So all this stuff feeds into your work. And as I pointed out, that one of the great things about art is how it conserves your life. That almost everything that's gone into your life stays there or can stay there and come out in the art. Whether it's something that happened when you were a tiny child and it sort of recurs later when you're 40. So there's a kind of a wonderful efficiency about that.
Yeah. And we're going to, I guess, move a bit away from the art for one question here and into your family life and your upbringing. And I want to make sure I get the quote right, because I found it kind of interesting, especially since it sort of flies in the face of what some people think, and that's just that, here's what you say, I'll quote you. To believe that a child can be forced to feel real hatred for Jews or blacks is like believing that a child can be forced to feel profound love for a particular aunt or cousin. Sort of speaking to the idea that, upbringing doesn't necessarily influence one's perspective on, minorities and really the world, I guess you could say. So I guess talk a little bit about that, because, you always sort of hear. And I got to compliment you. I'm going to break the question here again, but I got to compliment you just on, plumbing the depths again about your relationship with your dad. I lost my father about 2 years ago, so, I really was drawn to that part of the book. And my father was a lot like your dad, conservative, old school guy, so it was sort of like looking in the mirror in a lot of ways. And you and I turned out the same sort of way, very liberal, after coming off of the being raised by a conservative old school dad. But I guess talk a little bit about your observation, I guess you could say, about raising a child and how children grow up their own way and irregardless of the perspective of their parents.
Right. Well, one of the interesting things is that I became aware when I began thinking about it in an objective way. I became aware of the fact that I could never remember my father trying to sort of indoctrinate me or my sister or my brother into anti-Semitism and racism. The weird thing is that he just assumed that we would be that way. What's I find interesting here is that my father was he was quite a bit older too when I was born, but he was born in 1889, and so he was 11 in 1900, and as essentially a product of the 19th century. And I think that it was just for him natural to assume that one looked down on Jews and African Americans and so forth. And so I think he thought it would be natural that his kids would. And I think it came as kind of a shock that we weren't responding that way. And I just think that part of this is age and history. I forgot who it was who said that old-fashioned scientific tenets tend to disappear only when the people who hold them die.
Yeah.
That somehow instead of the new scientific ideas percolating up to older people, the older people tend to hold the old ones. That's why we're having trouble, I think, with a lot of people in the UFO field. But I think that this really very much applies to some of these social mores that my father held, and I do think that he was shocked when he found me arguing with him about this. It's just that in my friends in school and classmates and certainly getting to college and all that, I didn't really run into bigots in any way. Most people were pretty liberal and open about their attitudes towards minorities, and I think my father couldn't understand that would be the case, but it certainly was. And I think the thing that I wanted to deal with, it's more importantly here, going on what you said about philosophy of your own father and how this, my relationship with my father was meaningful to you, that I was trying to write a rounded picture of my father, almost in spite of myself. In other words, I didn't set out to deal with my father as much as I ended up doing in the book.
Yeah. Because
I think none of us really can consciously, focus on how much our fathers have influenced us. So as I wrote, I began to realize the many levels at which he had affected my life. And I wanted to include, of course, the horrible part, which is the bigotry and racism, but to show him as a very rounded and very loving person. And it's funny, I was talking to Jerry Clark, who had read the book, and Jerry said that he thought that was one of the most interesting parts of the book, and that he had some very good friends now, older people, who were also bigoted in the same way, but that he had enormous affection for them, and he understood the complexity of that kind of relationship with its many contradictory parts, really.
Absolutely, yeah. And, I'm just, I'm a little bit speechless here just because I'm thinking about my dad and just the book and just how much I connected with that whole part, because it really was like reading a lot of stuff about my dad too. So, to move back into the art world, I really was just fascinated with a lot of your observations in the book. And one of them was about how the painters you were friendly with were sort of ignorant about world affairs and politics. And I kind of found that a little bit interesting too, contrasting it in a weird way with people that are interested in the paranormal and the esoteric. And as I sort of joked earlier, if some of them wrote memoirs, it would be UFOs is life. It seems like they are ignorant of the arts in a way. So it's kind of a weird sort of juxtaposition. So I guess just talk a little bit about how ironic it was, I guess, that the painters you were friendly with really just didn't care too much about world affairs and were sort of in that bubble of the art industry.
Well, I think that what had happened, of course, is the older artists, when I was first in New York in the early 50s, and I was a kid just out of college, and the artists that I got to know were all mostly, they were 40 or 50 years old, and they had lived through the Depression in a way that I hadn't. I mean, I had been there, but I was such a little child I didn't know much what was going on. But they had all been through the Depression and had no money and were in a situation where they felt powerless. They didn't feel connected with the government. And, of course, what happened is that at the time I had first come to New York, Eisenhower had been elected. And, of course, with the great Richard Nixon as the vice president, we were in a terrible political backwater, actually. And so everybody was so depressed, and they had come out of feeling powerless through the recession, depression. And so they just sort of wrote it off. Nobody, they'd make cracks about Eisenhower and Nixon, but nobody was busy poring over the New York Times. I shouldn't say nobody was, but the majority were not. Art was just absolutely central to them. And I also pointed out in the book that how few of the artists I knew were really avid readers of literature, so poetry and so on. Some were, but it was, again, that wasn't it. As I mentioned in the book, the thing that everybody was into and totally obsessed about were movies. Everybody went to the movies and had opinions about the various auteur directors and so forth. But I think that politics it was such a backwater and such a bad time politically that people just sort of gave up.
Yeah. I guess what about the observation I made here about just how it seems like the opposite is true in a way with people in the esoteric, where they're more involved in the politics and then neglect the art side of life?
Yeah, well, first of all, we don't kid ourselves as painters that we have a huge audience. We really don't. I've said a number of times that I wonder what percentage of the homes or apartments in the United States, what percentage, say, of the living rooms in the homes and apartments have had more money spent on the art on the walls than on the lamps in the rooms. And I would imagine you're way down at the, 100th of a percent or something of that sort. It just is, nobody is, painting is seen as a really minority pastime. And, even though now it's has a great deal more popularity, more people go into museums, pouring into for the big blockbuster shows. But in those days, the museums in the 50s, the museums are pretty deserted.
Yeah.
I mean, you walk through the Museum of Modern Art, you'd go through 4 rooms and pass 2 people. And now, the place is crowded. So I think that we still have to face the idea that not that many people are interested in painting, modern painting or historical museums and so forth. Just in general, whether they're involved in UFO research or whether they're selling aluminum siding or whatever the hell they're doing.
Yeah.
I just don't think that there's that big an interest. And of course, I look around and I have a couple of friends who are poets, and I really feel sorry for them because nobody's really interested in poetry except other poets. And, for a book of poetry to sell 800 or 900 copies, is a huge success. And when you think of the potboiler novels that are millions of copies or so, so it's kind of depressing. I mean, we're in a kind of a cul-de-sac almost. It's just unfortunate.
Yeah, it is. 500 channels has saturated entertainment so much that it's really changed the face of popular culture in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, one of the things is that writing the memoir wasn't being avidly sought out by the big publishers because of its nature, because of its being a book about various complex subjects all intertwined, intermixed. But when I think about it, and having a small publisher bring the book out, and I'm thinking like, well, there are hundreds of thousands of people who have actually read my other books. You'd think there would be some more interest in this. But again, it's kind of memoir is often, especially of such a different kind of memoir. In other words, I'm not writing about how I was sexually abused as a child or overcame drunkenness or something, which the memoirs tend to be mostly about. So, there's still a kind of, I guess, ghettoization that goes on with art, and it's kind of unfortunate. But the UFO subject probably has, much more readership than art memoirs would.
Absolutely, and to make a sad point, too, even that readership, the UFO readership, is small in comparison to
it is.
The larger body of readers. Now, I did get an email from someone a while ago that asked me to try and get the guests to tell some more stories from their books and stuff like that, because I sort of focus on like what I've been doing so far, which is observations that that they make. So I guess the story that I think I'd like to hear you share is the near fight with Jack Kerouac, because I found it really interesting, and of course it's accompanied by sort of an observation of the way the scene was changing, I guess you could say, in New York, with the beat poets exploding on the scene, and how people seemed to think that they would be friends and compatriots with the abstract expressionist painters of the time, but really they were sort of two separate camps, and that's exemplified by your near fight with Jack Kerouac. So talk a little bit about that.
Thank God it was a near fight, too. Because, as I said in the book, he was a big, tough, and drunk, and I was none of the three at that time.
Yeah.
But at any rate, there's also a kind of interesting little coda to this. But my young wife at the time, Joan, who was probably maybe 19 or 20, and I was pretty young, we went to a party at the musician David Amram's. And David Amram is a jazz musician, but essentially is kind of a serious composer and a crossover musician, very interesting guy. And at the party, there weren't many artists, and Kerouac was there, and Corso and Ginsberg, and a lot of writers and musicians. And I left Joan to get a couple drinks for us or whatever it was. And when I came back, Kerouac had her sort of pinned against the wall, leaning over her, and just coming on like crazy, and very drunk. And she was looking sort of terrified, and I came over, and Kerouac gave me this look like, get the hell out of here, and I explained that this was my wife, and he should get the hell out of here. And at that point, he started into this kind of rage and started, cussing me out and balling his fists, that sort of thing. And Dave Amram was seeing what was going on. He came sailing over, and he escorted Joan and me out because she was scared, and I was certainly scared too. So we left, and the whole thing was Kerouac had written his book, which was a huge bestseller at that time, On the Road, and I think he just assumed he was entitled, at that point. He was a big shot, and I was a very, very little shot at that time. So the thing that's interesting about this sort of crazy near fight was that about 3 weeks ago, I was in Newport, Rhode Island, with some friends at a gathering of people who are involved with the UFO subject. And the woman who was the hostess, Anne Cuvalier, said, she said, I met a very interesting man who's visiting here, friends next door, and he said he's very interested in UFOs and wanted to come over. His name is David Amram. And I said, geez, my God, that's David Amram. I know David Amram very, very slightly, but I knew him casually the way we knew each other, many people, hundreds of people years ago. So he came over, and I told him the story, which, of course, was just one incident amongst probably 1,000 that he had. And he said, well, he spent a lot of time just exactly doing that, trying to pull Kerouac away from some kind of drunken fight. And he said he was sort of like a minder for Kerouac for time. He thought it was very funny because this was so in character. So, right out of his character as he knew him. But Dave Amram has turned out to be really interested in UFOs. So there was a kind of a circling around. And he and I are about the same age. So we share a lot of memories of different people of those times.
Yeah, that's strange. Yeah, it's a small world. Reminds me of the story in the book about your daughter taking the shuttle bus.
Yeah, is that something?
Yeah, that's an amazing story. Yeah, for the people who are wondering what we're talking about, taking the shuttle bus with a woman who was also heading to West Virginia, turned out from the same town as you, and in fact was hired by your family to go down to Florida when you were just a little boy and struggling to recover from polio. And she was sort of hired by your family as like a sort of a minder, if you will, or a babysitter for you. So it was like, wow, this is a strange, small world story. And that's sort of like the same thing here with the David Amram thing.
That was amazing. And actually my daughter was just here about having left Wellfleet on the Cape where I am about 20 minutes ago with my new grandchild. So, but that was something that happened to her when she was about 19, and when she got in this cab with an old lady, and they discovered they were going to the same small town in West Virginia. So, well, the world is full of coincidences like that.
Yeah, it's strange. I'm glad that story made it into the book. Now, as an artist, what inspires you, or what changes your thought process, I guess, to change mediums altogether? Because I was really surprised by how, you were doing all this painting, and then you moved to some amazing sculpture work, and it just seemed like so out of left field. But I'll confess that I'm blissfully ignorant to the art world. So this book was an amazing education for me about a whole bunch of stuff that I'd never even known about and really enjoyed. So maybe this is something that happens all the time, and I'm just a clown. But
no.
But I am interested in what makes an artist such as yourself, decide to change mediums so drastically like that.
Well, I suppose there are all kinds of factors that come into play, but I think that what was most important is as when I was really essentially into abstract expressionist painting, which was very painterly, meaning big, heavily loaded brushes, thick brush strokes. Jackson Pollock would come to most people's mind as an abstract expressionist and so forth. The whole process was liquid and filled with improvisation. And sculpture is not liquid and can't be improvised in the same way. You're dealing with heavy materials.
Mm-hmm.
So I never had any interest in it, as for me personally. But I think that what happened is when I started painting what I call guardian paintings and making sort of wall constructions that I call temples, and became more and more interested in ancient art, and actually went to Greece and was looking at incredible artifacts there. Of course, you're not really looking at painting because there isn't much Greek painting that survives. But you are looking at incredible sculpture, objects, solid three-dimensional objects. And since my head was going in the direction of these kinds of ancient, very emotionally rich, historically loaded objects that I was trying to sort of latch onto in my own work as a painter, I think that there was always kind of muttering in the background the possibility of doing work that was three-dimensional, because that would in a strange way bring it even closer to some of the older images that I was, really inspired by. So I found myself getting more and more interested in something that I had paid very little attention to in terms of my own creative process. I certainly loved and admired sculpture and went to sculpture shows and so forth, but I wasn't thinking of doing anything myself in that direction. And as I mentioned in the book, Ad Reinhardt, the painter, had a very negative view of sculpture, and he defined sculpture on exhibit in a gallery as something you backed into when you were looking at a painting on the wall.
Yeah, I remember that.
So that was more or less my attitude too. But then I became extremely involved with, as an admirer of Brancusi's work. And it's a long story. We'd have to have slides, but I don't think we have the slides available right now. But that's what happened. I think it became important for me to try to make three-dimensional objects which had a different quality from the painting, because they did not seem improvised in any way. They seemed kind of monolithic, as if they've been that way for centuries. And I wanted them to look ancient. Yeah. You make a great sort of, I don't know if it was you or an art critic who made I think it was you that sort of you're almost inventing like your own ancient world in a way with these pieces. So I wanted these things to look like, instead of looking like a modern sculpture, to look like something that if you came across it in a forest, in a clearing, it might look like some sort of altar from some ancient religion that's long since passed. Yeah. Because that kind of thing really interests me. The idea that, as I said in the book, that it seems to me that even though art has changed again and again and again, what has remained unchanged is what's really interesting to me. And that is that works of art end up in some way mediating between us as human beings and all the questions that we all have about what's out there and what comes after death, and if anything. And so therefore, the idea of an altar or a temple to an unknown religion is interesting to me.
Yeah, I got a few more points here on the artwork, and then we'll get into the UFO stuff, and I want to just sort of, first of all, obviously, tell people to go out and buy the book, and I want to note a few things that they should look for that we're not going to get a chance to talk about here in the book, but I wanted to put over from the art portion of the book, notably Mark Rothko and the haunting concept of him always painting the grave, and you'll know what I'm talking about, folks, when you read the book, but it's haunting. And Budd's amazing observations and interactions with Jackson Pollock, that's in there, and Franz Klein, and I believe it was the dream, it was Franz in the dream, right?
Oh, yeah, that was an amazing experience for me, I tell you.
Absolutely. Now, I'll leave those 3 talking points there for folks to go and find out about in the book. So go buy the book and look for those parts of the book, because all 3 of those aspects of the art portion of the book are amazing and stayed with me having read the book and following completion of reading the book. Now, the next point here in the notes I want to talk to you about, which I found compelling, and I wanted to get your perspective on it, because as a non-artist, it left me sort of in the dark. You talk about your friendship with Robert Motherwell, and notably, he put together this series called The Spanish Elegy, and you pointed out that one of them, to him, you thought that one of the paintings was, and this is what the word you used, was a failure, and that towards the end of the story you say that recently you destroyed 11 of your older paintings, which you deemed failures, and I guess the question is, and it's kind of basic, but as I said, I'm not really an artist, so I don't understand what constitutes a failure. What do you mean when you say that something's a failure?
Well, there's a little difference between the Motherwell situation and mine. Motherwell had done a series of paintings which he called Spanish Elegies, as you mentioned, and they were shown at the National Gallery in Washington as a group. And they're very closely related to one another. I won't describe them, but they're mostly black and white. They're very powerful. They're his best paintings, really, I think. But he had one painting there that simply didn't work because, shall we say, it had too many moving parts. The other paintings were much simpler, and they seemed far more powerful and tougher. This one seemed to have a lot of little fragmentary parts to it, which weakens the effect of the strength that the other paintings had. So my problem there with this, which I said to him, was that I thought it was weakening the impact of the whole series, the whole idea of these elegies. And he was thinking of giving it to a museum, and I said I didn't think he should do it. And it was a very difficult thing to do, because he was a senior artist, a lot older than I, and so on. But in my case, when I destroyed these paintings, essentially what they were was very early paintings, which were not parts of any particular series, but which were actually much more transitional in my work, where I wasn't as clear about what I was doing as I became a few years later. So these paintings were all dating from the 1950s, and I just felt that, in a certain sense, if you put them all up together, they would seem to be a slightly incoherent group. And I decided that I would cover my tracks and destroy them.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. All right. And then, as pointed out throughout the book and on the back here, your works are in all sorts of amazing and awesome museums: the Guggenheim, the Whitney, Metropolitan Museums, Boston's Museum of Fine Arts, New York's Museum of Modern Art. This is going to maybe sound like an ignorant question, but maybe not. But let's say someone goes to the Guggenheim, or I'm a stone's throw from Boston, so I'm definitely going to have to go over to the Museum of Fine Arts to look for your stuff. How does one find your paintings in these great museums? This
is, of course, the problem. You most likely won't, because museums have absolutely gigantic collections, and what they can exhibit at any one time is really a tiny percentage of the collection. The Museum of Modern Art, which had a number of years ago, had expanded its exhibition space enormously, and they have a lot of space now available for loan shows, which come in, which means that the works they're showing are being borrowed from the artist or from collections and so forth. But apparently the Museum of Modern Art felt that even if they gave all of the wall space and all of the exhibition galleries to their permanent collection that they could only show a little less than 2% of it.
Oh, wow.
98% would be in storage. And I would guess at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, well, as example, they have a superb Picasso, late one, called The Rape of the Sabines. It's a version of an older painting. And I've only seen that up twice since I've been going to the Boston Museum. So that's a major Picasso. So the problem is that people in my generation that they own are lucky if let's say they have my age range, or let's say they have 300 paintings, 300 different paintings by different people. I would imagine that it would be lucky if you'll see 20 of the 300 up. So, there's it's just a terrible problem. The Guggenheim used to send out a note to you when they were actually hanging a painting. I don't think they do that anymore, though. But when they're hanging a work of yours. But this is one of the major problems. Just to give you an idea that the Museum of Modern Art did a catalog of the Picassos that it owns, and this catalog came out in the 70s. And in the 30 years since then, they've probably acquired lots of Picassos. People donate them and so forth when they die, So when I went to the museum, when they rehung the expanded show, Picasso was the most, his works were the most prevalent of anybody's. And I looked at the catalog when I went home from the 30-year-old catalog and found 37 major Picassos in there that weren't up.
Oh, wow.
So 37 Picassos were not hanging from 30 years ago, and there are probably another 30 or 40 new Picassos that they've acquired since then. So, the whole picture is just ridiculous. Some of the museums do a good job of lending parts of the collection to smaller museums around the country. But things are shown from time to time, and things of mine are shown from time to time. But often, I guess, it's better to go online and see if you can find something, even though that's not so complete. And when I say online, I mean going to the museum's websites.
Yeah. Okay, that's probably good, because otherwise I'd end up at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston demanding to see the Hopkins, and they would probably throw me out.
They have a really good one. Well, now, the thing is, in the back of the book, the back cover, I have a painting called Mahler's Castle, which is, I think, the second from the end of the four. And that's the study, which I still own, for the painting that's in the Boston Museum. It's an 11-foot painting.
Awesome.
And it's a really terrific painting, but I can guarantee it's not up. This is one of the sad stories about the art world. The gigantic holdings that we all like to see that just don't get shown.
It's like the Indiana Jones movie there, when they put the Holy Grail in the Smithsonian warehouse and just keeps panning back, and you see how big it is. Now, I guess the perfect segue question here from the art world to the UFO world is an observation you make towards the end of the book about how people with New Age beliefs gravitate towards the Egyptian and Mayan cultures, which is really sort of a very different from other forms and stuff like that. And just sort of an interesting observation, I guess you could say, on the New Age world. So I guess talk a little bit about that, and that'll sort of be the perfect bridge for us to get into the UFO stuff.
Well, the thing is that I was talking about that because when I would be making European trips and giving talks, going to conferences and things, I, of course, always go to museums and made God knows how many trips. And looking at the things that appealed to me, I realized that Egyptian art was very, of course, very monumental, very stiff, very formal, eyes straight ahead, arms at the side of the striding figures and so forth. And it was all sort of oriented towards the afterlife. But it was very rigid, and in a certain sense, it always brought to mind to me the idea that these things were made by slaves and for the glory of the gods and pharaohs and so forth, and the priests. And the more I saw of Greek art, which showed people in much more normal, casual poses and was obviously much more sensual. There's almost no real sexuality in Egyptian art. But the Greek sculpture seemed much more lifelike. And of course the temples were absolutely beautiful. They weren't as ponderous as the Egyptian temples. And I began to gravitate towards that. And I realized that as I'm going towards Greek sculpture, Greek art, Greek architecture, and away from Egyptian, and of course the Mayan is also sort of ominous looking. I realized that the essentially New Age people tend to stick with Egypt, and which they see as the font of everything. Everything came from ancient Egypt, and that's where all the mysteries are. And there was a complete kind of willingness to turn away from Greece. And it's, to me, it sort of boiled down to a kind of turning away from the sensuality and richness and pleasures of everyday life, and turning towards, in Egypt, an idea of some sort of afterlife or golden age or whatever. So as I was looking at things, I began to understand that many New Age people really require incredible mysteries that cannot be easily fathomed, and that's what they see in Egyptian art.
Yeah.
And the rigidity of it and the coldness of it, because I do think Egyptian art is cold. The coldness of it, or most of it, of course, has an uncomfortable resemblance in my mind with the coldness of alien behavior and alien appearance. The non-sensual, non-sexual, non-human, non-emotional coldness that is so often reported in UFO abductions.
Yeah. So I guess then we'll move in now to the UFO realm of your career here. And as you note in the book, the 1964 UFO sighting that you had on the Cape really sort of kicked off your interest in UFOs. But I want to move back further backward into your life to an observation that you made that I'd never really considered. First of all, I found it really amazing and cool that you were around for the original War of the Worlds broadcast, which is obviously legendary and infamous even to this day. Yep. And you make the remarkable observation that the War of the Worlds broadcast sort of, well, you say it inoculated you against taking UFO reports seriously, and I think you sort of extend that out to the greater populace as well.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any doubt about it that the long-term results of the broadcast really included the idea that people were not going to listen to anything that sounded like a sort of extraterrestrial experience of any sort, because having been burnt once, they were not going to be burnt twice. And instead of increasing an interest in the subject, it poured ice water on an interest. And I think that was, it was certainly my experience, but I think it was the experience of people at the time. What was so interesting to find is that this poll that, I don't know who exactly had taken the poll, but Jerome Clark is the one who discovered this, that was taken in 1947 at the end of the year, and they asked people what they thought of the UFO phenomenon, which is, of course, being widely reported there, and what was behind it, and everybody said things like misidentifications and Russian scouts and one damn thing after another, and fewer than 1%, which is statistically insignificant then, said that they thought it might be extraterrestrial. Like the whole country, according to that poll, heard about UFOs and had read about them, but thought there was nothing to them.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about.
So I think that's the proof of the pudding about my observation about the War of the Worlds broadcast.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I said, I'd never really even thought about that till I read the book, because obviously a lot of people sort of attribute that to as a sort of test in a way to see how the population would react to that sort of situation, but I never really considered the fallout in the way that you did. these notes here for the UFO material and abduction research, a little more scattershot, so I forgive me for that in a sense. First of all, I guess talk a little bit about sort of how you transitioned from an interest in straight up UFOs into the abduction stuff, because everybody knows you broke the ground really with abduction research, and it wasn't like nowadays when someone would have an interest in UFOs and then it would turn into abductions. With you, it just sort of like led that way, and there wasn't really too many guideposts along the way, except for maybe the Betty and Barney Hill case and another one you cite. But it's like, you were really breaking ground there with even looking into the abduction part of it.
Well, there were other people looking into it too, and Ray Fowler being one who was doing very fine work, still does. But the point is that, at the time that I got involved in the Obarski case, that was 1975, the landing observed by witnesses in New Jersey right across the Hudson River from Manhattan. That was the first case I ever investigated, looked into. It was really the fulcrum turn on which things turned. But the point is that I knew at that point and had accepted, I'd come to accept, the Betty and Barney Hill case and also the Pascagoula case. And those were about the only cases I knew anything about. So by that time, I was already, even though I didn't know that much about it, I was aware that these things had been reported, and they seemed very believable to me. But they hadn't at first, but by that time, 75, they did seem believable. So when I wrote an article for the Village Voice about this Obarski case, the New York newspaper, and there was a lot of subsequent coverage, and I did some radio call-in programs, which was all new to me. I didn't know what I was doing exactly, but there I was. And because my name was given in the article, of course, and George's name too, an address, at least the area where he lived, we started getting letters, and I started getting letters and call-ins on these programs from people who were describing initially something very much like what George had seen. And I used an example that the man called in and said he'd seen something very much like that. It was right above his car, and his car stopped. And he said, but we didn't see the thing leave. And it was 30 or 40 feet above his car. He didn't see it leave, which anybody would have, of course, been staring at it, And he got home very late, and so I began getting some of these cases, these descriptions, that the people weren't really describing as abductions. They just didn't know what happened and why the time passed without their being able to recall it. And very often these things of not remembering how the thing ended, the experience of seeing the object. And so from that I began to infer that, well, maybe these things are abductions, because they seem to have some of the guidelines that had appeared in the Hill case and the Pascagoula case. So I just started looking into them. I wasn't seeking out abductions, but because I knew about those two cases, at least, and I think I'd heard of a couple of others in 1975, I began taking these things seriously, potentially these reports, and it began to uncover one after another of abductions because I was able to get some friends who were psychiatrists and psychologists to do hypnosis for me, to help fill in the missing time. And so, in a certain sense, I didn't set out to discover anything with this, but I followed where the data led, and that's what I began stumbling into, and I'm still stumbling.
The work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
You're listening to Banal of America Audio.
The work begins anew. The hope rises again, and the dream lives on.
Yeah, it's remarkable to look back on it. and see how it developed that way, because you didn't just jump in and were like, I'm all about abductions. It was like, they kind of fell into your lap, and next thing you know, you were the abduction guy. So
yeah, well, one of the things is that in the way I structured the book, I wanted to go back to spend more time with these really early cases, because I wanted to get the reader sort of in the position that I had been in, and to see exactly how I approached it, how my mind was working, and to sort of hope the reader would go through the same process of questioning and trying to put two and two together and so forth. So some of those early cases are, an attempt putting them there. It's not just a matter of simple recollection and all that, but it was like an attempt to lead the person who's new to this through from A to B to C and so on, because that's the way it happened to me.
Yeah, and you do a masterful job. As I said, you really sort of lay out the story of how it all happened, which is what the book really is, and that's really what I enjoy. And we need more people to write these kind of books, more people like you who've been in the field for so long and were trailblazers and groundbreakers, so we can understand how this history of the phenomenon unfolded, because that stuff's getting lost, I think, over time, and we need more people to write memoirs. So I take my hat off to you for that.
Well, I think that's true, and my friend David Jacobs is up here in Wellfleet right now with his family, and just as an example, when David writes about the hybrid phenomenon, which I also wrote about in Sight Unseen, and you have this whole absolutely off-the-wall subject of these transgenic beings wandering around that are part human and part alien, you think, my God, that's as crazy, as wild as science fiction thing. And yet, if you go back and see the way that that's sort of the end point of a process that started 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, yeah, in terms of what we've discovered about it, you can see that you have to go back to the beginning. And I didn't do anything much in the book about some of the later aspects of the phenomenon, just because I wanted to concentrate on how people are led into this, how I was led into it. It would be great if David Jacobs would write a memoir. I've talked to him about it, because when I first met him, he thought that in 1981 he thought that abductions were ridiculous.
Yeah.
Look where he is now.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's just because of what's the way the evidence led him. You're dragged by the damn data into this, and you're stuck with it. I think I pointed out that when I wrote about the intruders, about the whole process of abductions and women finding themselves pregnant, and then re-abduction, and they're suddenly not pregnant, and then they have these abduction experience, quote-unquote dreams, whatever, where they are shown a small baby or a small toddler that is half alien, half human. I was writing about this in Intruders, and I was getting roundly attacked by all the biologists who said, you can't get a hybrid. Hybrids don't work. That a male cell and a female cell from different species are not going to create a living being. But I'm saying, but I've got all this data. All these people are reporting the same damn thing.
Yeah.
So what do I do about it? I can't scrap the data because you're telling me it's impossible.
Exactly.
But that's what they were really asking. And, of course, when the genome was mapped and people began to do gene splicing, suddenly we had a new theory, and the new theory supported the idea that these creatures could exist. So it was kind of, for me, a wonderful way of proving to myself, and I hope to other people, that if you've got the data, you have to explain the data, whatever your damn theory is. If the theory contradicts the data, tough luck.
Exactly. Well, hopefully, it seems like maybe science is starting to catch up with ufology for a change. So hopefully that'll continue onward. Now, this is kind of a speculative question, but I'm sure you've pondered it yourself, and I presume probably somebody's asked you this before, but I want to know your opinion. We had Ann Druffel on the show back in February, and she was sort of talking about how the abduction reports and stuff really sort of exploded in the 70s and stuff. And, of course, everybody knows about the contactee period of ufology.
Yeah.
And, of course, you know, the veracity of that notwithstanding, I find it hard to believe that 100% of all contactee stories are false. So the question is, there's really a stark line between the contactee era and the abduction era. What do you think is behind that transition from contactees to abductees?
Well, I think the origin of the two phenomena are so different, the origins. For instance, as far as I'm concerned, the abduction phenomenon developed out of reports that were made privately and in confidence and very nervously by the people who were having the experiences.
Yeah.
Looking for no publicity, or exactly the opposite, and who were really bewildered by what happened. And so, in a certain sense, it came about in a very slow and, again, data-driven way, and the people were automatically seen, like the Hills and the Pascagoula people and so forth, as really believable people. But the way the contactee thing started was after you had the UFO waves coming in 47, 48, and 49 and so forth.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people who were either motivated by money and the idea of cheap fame by saying, oh, I know what those things are. I can tell you all about them. I've been on one. I went to Venus, you know.
Yeah.
Or on the other hand, people who were mentally unbalanced, who we run into in the abduction field from time to time too, had convinced themselves that these things had happened to them, but they didn't come about through shy, quiet, nervous people trying to look for answers. They were people who already had the answers that they were going to share with people for a fee. Dave Jacobs talks about the guy who used to sell little packets of dog hair from the for $5 from the hair of a Venusian dog. And you know, I mean, the whole thing was so filled with fraud and deceit and craziness and delusion.
Yeah.
And it was so deliberately public. I mean, the idea that there could be a great rock, Devil's Rock, whatever it's called, festival of abductees is crazy. I mean, nobody wanted to get in a room and be seen as an abductee.
Yeah.
You know, and yet here are all these people driving out into the desert to hear the words from on high, from what our space brothers had told them. And so I think when you say 100% contactees, you know, can't be all crazy or fraudulent or something.
Yeah.
I think what you have to realize is that people come forward with messages or with experiences of one sort or another that seem more in the contactee field. I think those experiences have to be looked at, and they have to be looked at in the context of there being more to those experiences than the person is consciously remembering. Mm-hmm. And therefore, these experiences may turn out to be more of a typical abduction than it would seem. I mean, that's been the situation in my experience. As an example, a woman came to me, I'll try to make it real short, a young woman. She had been abducted, but everything was wonderful. She loved the UFO occupants and so forth. And they had been very helpful because she had been in a hotel room with her lover, who was an older man who'd had a heart attack or something at some point. And the aliens came in, but they were very different. One of them was actually her mother, who had died.
Oh, wow.
And who came over to her and so forth. And there was another a female who was the deceased ex-wife of her boyfriend. At any rate, these wonderful aliens came over, and the abductee, was kind of amazed because her mother started scolding her. And she didn't look exactly like her mother, but almost, scolding her, and took her over to a mirror, and she was looking into the mirror, and it was as if her mother was telling her, you've got to change your life, be a better person, and so on and so forth. And so all this was a very good thing, and they were telling her they were going to help heal this man's heart. And he was terrified too. He was sitting up right in bed. But anyway, it's a very complicated story. But when we did hypnosis, and she had really intense belief that this is the way it happened.
Yeah.
When we did hypnosis, the aliens came in, and oddly enough, they didn't really look like her mother or the ex-wife. They looked like the regular aliens.
Yeah.
And she said, there's something about, under hypnosis, there's something about my boyfriend's health. She said, they're going to help, or she said, no, I'm begging them to help with his heart. The whole issue of the healing came from her. She's begging them telepathically. But then her mother comes over to her, not her mother, it's an alien, and is taking her up to the mirror, but all of a sudden with horror, she says, it's not the mirror, it's a window. We're going out to a UFO which is hovering outside. So the whole thing changed slowly, you know, into something. So what I'm saying about when you hear a contactee story or something, you know, unless the person is patently crazy or money grubbing or something, you have to assume that there might be more to this, you know, and it's worth looking into.
Yeah, absolutely. Like perhaps we hadn't refined the research techniques enough back in the 50s and 60s when the contactees were going on to actually understand that they were really abductions all along.
There certainly must have been abduction. Well, we know there were abductions at the time. The earliest abduction cases I've ever dealt with is two elderly women separately, two different cases, who were both abducted in the 1920s.
Oh, wow.
They're good cases, too. And I've certainly worked with a number of people from the 30s and 40s that had the abductions as children, you know.
Yeah.
So the point is, it's been going on. It isn't some kind of just recent post-war kind of a phenomenon.
Yeah.
So we have no way of knowing how those things were sort of how they were remembered by people at the time, how much screen memory was going on, and so forth.
Exactly.
So that's one of the things. When you begin to sense that there's more to a story that somebody's telling you, contactee or not, about some odd, even just a sighting. Some of these things that are just sightings, the person remembers them that way, but they're just things that begin to come out in the way they're talking about the sighting that make you think, well, something else happened. It wasn't just that.
Yeah. You make the note in the book that the title of your first book, Missing Time, has become part of the lexicon of the esoteric world, which is really kind of neat and cool, and I'm sure that it is a source of pride for you, and I'd be tremendously proud if I had that kind of influence on the field. Another sort of phraseology that you talk about in the book is confirmation anxiety. Talk a little bit about that, because I found that really particularly interesting and a unique observation that you made that I'm sure is also kind of part of the lexicon now.
Well, that's a little more obscure, but at any rate, what I meant by confirmation anxiety is that when a person who's had abduction experiences finds out that, in fact, it seems absolutely incontrovertible that the experience did happen to them, outside witnesses turn up or some kind of evidence, instead of celebrating and saying, you see, I was right all along or something like that, it's, oh my God, it really, really happened. And it's a shock. They don't like it. They don't like that kind of confirmation because most people want to put an abduction experience on some kind of mental shelf, which is really saying maybe it didn't really happen after all. Maybe there is some explanation or whatever.
Yeah.
They don't want to face this coldly that, yes, I was in this ship and I was put on this table and this and that happened. So as an example, I mentioned in the book that I have samples from 45 different people of some kinds of symbols, the notational system, writing, or whatever you might want to call it, which are extraordinarily similar, in some cases identical, from 45 different people. And these are symbols that they have seen inside a ship in some way or other. Mm-hmm. And I just don't do this anymore, but at one point I was working with a woman, a young African-American woman, who had had a missing time experience and all kinds of things connected with it, and it was clearly an abduction. And we had done a hypnotic regression And I had just asked her under hypnosis, did she see any, as you look around, I said, do you see anything that looks like writing any place? I said, maybe you do, maybe you don't, you know.
Yeah.
No, she did see something. And I said, well, you look at that. She said she saw several marks, symbols, didn't know what they meant, because nobody knows what this means. So I said, take a good look, and then afterwards you can draw them for me. So we went on, and after we were finished, she drew them for me, and they matched I had in a portfolio that I put together of other samples.
Interesting.
And I went upstairs, and I was in the lower studio. I went to my upper studio and got this thing, which I shouldn't have done. And I brought it down, and I just opened it up and showed her these others. And her eyes hit that page, and she burst into tears, and she jumped up, and she started to run out of the room.
Oh, wow.
And we had to bring her back and calm her down. And, well, that's a classic case of confirmation anxiety. Confirmation was just the worst thing she would happen. So I don't do that anymore with anybody. Not that I did it very often. I did it to one other person. Had the same result.
Okay.
So that's what that means. But it's another sign that the people who have these experiences do not want them to be real.
Yeah, yeah. Now, we had Bruce Rux on the show a few weeks ago, and he's a big proponent of the ET as robot hypothesis, being that, these entities that perform the abductions perhaps might be robots. And you do make the point in the book about how sometimes they do make mistakes, notably when they redress the abductees,
Yeah.
and they put the shirts on backwards and put the earrings on backwards and stuff like that, which is almost consistent, I guess, perhaps with the idea that maybe they are robots because they're making these mistakes that you would think that the aliens, if there's some kind of higher intelligence, wouldn't make. Although then again, we're a pretty primitive culture to them, I'm sure, so they probably wouldn't understand earrings. But what do you think of the idea of the abductors as robots or in some way, and also, that whole idea that they make these mistakes during the abductions?
Well, I tend not to try to say exactly what they're constituted of or where they come from or anything like that.
Yeah. Because
we don't know. That's why the word alien is useful, because it doesn't denote anything except what something isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, I've quoted this a number of times, a UFO researcher once said that he did not believe the UFO occupants were extraterrestrial because they're not doing what extraterrestrials would do, which I thought was one of the most bizarre things to say.
Yeah.
Because who knows what an unknown would do? You say, okay, we're positing that they are unknown. So what are their limits? What are their skills? We don't. None of that is really possible to state with any authority. So I don't know. There have been some people theorizing that some of the figures are more robotic, and I know Charlie Hickson in his abduction thought of the three figures as being robotic, him and Parker aboard. But I don't really know. As a matter of fact, I just don't think that it's worth spending the time to worry the subject, because we don't know. How are we going to ever find out?
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Of course, you've done a lot of work and talked about these and another sort of phraseology that's part of the lexicon, let's hope more and more, the presentation memories, which is when, these women who've had their babies taken then are reintroduced, I guess you could say, to the babies later on down the line. Now, when these sort of things happen, is that a one-time occurrence, or do they continue throughout, the hybrid's lifetime and the abductees' experiences?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I have two cases where there seems to have been a second presentation, but I think as a rule, I'm not getting reports that they get a second look. They may make the person feel they're going to see the child or the baby again, but that doesn't seem to happen, except in just a couple of cases. it's interesting to me that I think that the aliens believe when this bonding takes place and they hand the child or the baby to the putative mother to hold or whatnot, I think they believe that there's something innately healthful in the human touch that needs to be done. It just seems that it's the only reason they seem to do this.
Yeah.
You know, I can't think of any other reason, because what it does to the mother, if of course this person is the mother, but what it does to the mother, of course, is to create all kinds of emotional cross currents, which are really powerful. So it doesn't really help the mother in any way. So then you have to assume, well, it must be somehow instead for the child. So it must be something that the aliens feel the child gains by.
Yeah, yeah.
But we really don't know, what the mechanics of all this are.
Makes you think about adoptees and their, how some adoptees go through that quest to find their real parents.
There are overlaps, no doubt about it.
And then, sort of in keeping with the emailer who asked for more stories, I'm going to ask you to tell the Shirley MacLaine story, because it was just amazing. Obviously I'd like you to tell the story, and I just found it really interesting, and maybe you can elucidate a little more on this when you tell the story, but I just found it really amazing that these high-powered politicians were even hanging around with Shirley MacLaine in this hotel room. It almost feels like the whole scene where she had you and I believe like the first woman to really talk about the whole presentation.
Yeah.
Yes, Kathy.
Kathy, yeah.
It almost felt like this thing was orchestrated in a way. Why was she even hanging around with all these high-powered politicians? And then all of a sudden, she has you guys brought up, and of course, her reaction to the whole thing is just sad, I guess is the best way to put it.
Well, I tell you what, I'd rather skip the exact thing that occurred with Kathy and MacLaine, and jump to the part of the question about why they were there.
That's fine.
And I think that I don't see anything out of keeping. The basic point was that even though Bella Abzug was there, and she was a congresswoman at that point from New York City, Shirley MacLaine was in Washington, where, of course, some of these people lived. They worked there. And she had a tremendous following, still does. The important senator there, Claiborne Pell from Rhode Island, head of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, he has been interested, he's passed away, he'd been interested in the subject very intensely and in esoteric subjects in general. And I had a couple of occasions to talk to him, and he was extremely interested in the subject. So since she had written about the UFO subject in some sort of cockamamie way, I have to say, but since she had done that and was, of course, deeply involved in esoteric issues, it would be very natural for him to be there because he was drawn to this.
Mm-hmm.
And the retired naval officer was at that point his chief of staff. And the other very important man, a European, is a man who has been extremely interested in the UFO subject and was a very good friend of Senator Pell. And that man, incidentally, who still wants his anonymity maintained, I sent him a copy of the book, and he wrote me a very, very nice letter back. So his being there was not mysterious in any way. I don't think there wasn't any sense that there was anything military about this or intelligence. And Bella Abzug was a fiery kind of government handout. She was, would reject in a second. So I don't think there was anything mysterious about that gathering. If it had happened in South Dakota, yes, but Washington, where most of them lived, was not a surprise.
Okay.
But MacLaine's behavior, which is I'd rather not go into, let people read this. And incidentally, I should point out when you mention people should buy the book, which I wholeheartedly support. The book is best ordered from Amazon.com, or you can go into like Barnes & Noble and ask them to order it, that kind of thing. But it's not on the shelves in bookstores. It's a small publisher, so Amazon's the best way to get at it.
Absolutely, yeah, that's fine. We have to leave some stuff here for the book anyway, and people should definitely read the book just for that story alone,
it's also complicated to sell,
Yeah, exactly. We want to cover as much as we can here in the conversation. Now, one thing I really enjoyed was your interaction with Carl Sagan and your response to the refrain of the skeptics: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and you came up with a retort to that, which is the quantity of evidence behind this extraordinary phenomenon requires an extraordinary investigation, and took the tack that I've been sort of endorsing for a while, and I was happy to read, later on when you talked about Leslie's press conference in 2007, she sort of took the same tact as well.
Yes. In
that, I just feel like, ufology, for lack of a better term, really sort of needs a PR shift and needs a PR change, where we have to stop trying to convince people that this is real and just convince them to give it a chance.
Exactly. That's where you start. And you see, no scientist can really say, well, I don't think we should do an investigation, and because you say, well, on what grounds are you saying that? Well, there isn't anything to this. There's no evidence. You don't know the evidence,
Yeah.
et cetera. I mean, it's sort of a catch-22 you can back them into. But this is where I have these tremendous problems with the quote-unquote disclosure people who are insisting that the government announced that the extraterrestrials are here. Instead of the government announcing, we got a problem here that's better be looked into. That's an easy one to sell to somebody, but just to try to sell the idea that the extraterrestrials are here and there's a government cover-up that's been going on for years, all of which may well be true, of course, but you can't really sell that to the New York Times or whatever.
Exactly. And it may even be more palatable for the government if we phrased it that way, because then
I think that the government likes nothing better than some of the exopolitics stuff that's being handed around, where they'll have a press conference and announce in Washington to the Washington Post that there's an advanced culture, civilization living on Mars underground, as if this is a fact. And, you can have the Washington Post do what it does. They just laugh uproariously at this. And somehow, you could almost think that these are just disinformation agents doing this to us, from within our own camp.
Absolutely, yeah. It's frustrating, because you want to say to these people, you're selling a damaged bill of goods to people, and it's going to catch up with you, because if you can't prove what you're saying, then they're going to discount it wholeheartedly.
Yeah. And
it'd be much easier if we just sort of rephrased the whole issue.
Absolutely. If you could present enough reasons why an investigation should be made, and certainly that material exists. And Leslie, incidentally, is working on a book right now, which is going to be dynamite on the subject. From high-level witnesses and military people and government authorities and so forth who have been in other countries working on the UFO project for years. It's really dramatic stuff. But the point is that if you can persuade people that the evidence exists and it's got to be looked into, that's one thing. But if what your goal is, as with some of the exopolitics types, is that you've got to persuade them that extraterrestrials are flying around and they've come here and the government knows about it and is covering it up. You're trying to get them to accept your particular answer to the mystery rather than trying to sell them on the existence of the mystery to start with.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, now what do you think needs to be done to sort of change that perspective? Kind of like what Leslie did with the press conference, where you just leave
absolutely.
the answer hanging?
that's one of the first things, and I think her book is going to be one of the major things, because many of the people who were at the press conference are contributing to the book. The book is a collection of contributions from, I think she'll have 3 or 4 generals in it, and it's an amazing thing. So it's due to be published next summer.
Awesome.
But it's going to be quite a book, and I think that's the kind of thing that you cannot read. Nobody objective in mind could read that book and not think, Jesus, there's something going on here that we better damn well look into.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the goal.
Now, you were at the ground floor of abductions, and obviously you saw the explosion of abductions in, for lack of a better term, popularity in the mainstream media. What do you think of how they've been portrayed over the last 30 years? Not just in entertainment, but also, in the news and stuff like that.
Well, it's the toughest sell, obviously, to present this. And I think that when I first got involved in this, I would guess that there are fewer than 10% of the UFO researchers who took UFOs seriously thought there was anything to abductions. I mean, David Jacobs being a good example. Mm-hmm. And probably now, I think in the polls, the numbers are up like in the 30% and up, believe across the country that UFO abductions are taking place. I'd like to see a really good poll on that taken. But so in other words, it's a slow incremental growth. And one of the great things, of course, about television is that you're looking at faces and listening to voices, and you're making up your mind whether that person seems to be a liar or telling the truth or mentally ill or whatnot. And so many of these programs, I think, have had a tremendous effect, a positive effect. And, of course, some of the debunkers who turn up on these programs are so unpleasant or goofy looking or whatever that, it's hard to be sympathetic. And it's also hard to be sympathetic with somebody who spent his life saying no to something.
Yeah.
You wonder why in the world, what a way to live. But I think that on the whole, it's been a really tough slog with this, and I've certainly gotten some pretty bad knocks. I mean, the Peter Jennings thing was awful because of all the absolute promises they made to me about what would be included, including my statements about sleep paralysis, and all of it was cut, and abductions were not quite ridiculed, but almost. And so, you get some lucky ones sometimes, but I think it's a very uncomfortable subject for everybody concerned. I mean, certainly uncomfortable for any abductees to come forward, and I've been telling people not to do it, if they're asked. As a matter of fact, I turned down one recently. They wanted me to rustle up some abductees so they could, make a program.
Sure.
I said it's not going to work,
Yeah.
But I think that slowly it's been only an uphill. I mean, it's only been a gain.
Obviously, as I said just now, you were on the ground floor of the abduction thing, and David Jacobs, and of course Dr. John Mack, who we lost a few years ago. How do you think the field of abduction research has evolved over the last 30 years, and do you think it's headed in the right direction? Do you think it's refined its approach in a positive way? And what's your perspective on how things have changed? Because in a weird way, of course, you're going to know who is the next generation of Budd Hopkins and John Mack and David Jacobs, but we haven't, at least as far as where I'm sitting and where people who are sort of interested in the paranormal but look at all the different subjects and stuff, we haven't seen that breakout researcher just yet, as far as I can tell.
That's one of the problems. I have to agree that that's what should be visible and doesn't seem to be. I know a few people, and in New York, there's a man who is good, and but we don't have enough people willing to do this. And of course, the professional mental health community doesn't like to do anything that's going to besmirch their reputation, and also they don't like to do pro bono work. And so it's been difficult to get good people. There are some people around, younger people, but this is an area where we haven't been very successful, I have to say, in training new people. It's unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll have to just keep an eye out for the next generation here of you guys who were really on the ground floor of this. Now, looking at how your interpretation and research into the abduction phenomenon itself has evolved, you know, I mean, you didn't really sort of uncover this whole hybrid aspect of it until, you know, later on into your research into the phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Has anything sort of new turned up in the last few years as far as, you know, where this next step might be going with the abductions? Because, like I said, you started out with just pure abductions, and then it turned into the reproduction stuff. So do we know what the next part is, or has anything emerged?
I think that the really next thing is the presence of these transgenic beings here on Earth. I think that's the next step, and we have no idea how widespread that is. David Jacobs has, of course, been working very diligently in that area. It's a pretty spooky damn thing to be working on, too.
Absolutely.
I think that's where the discoveries are going to be made and the battles waged, actually. So I don't know what that's going to turn into, and none of us do, but it's looking more ominous than not ominous, that's for sure.
Hey, that's for sure, absolutely. Now, abductions and abduction research sort of was born, obviously, out of the UFO phenomenon, but I just came into this in the last, 6 years, and it seems like the abduction field stands apart from the UFO field in a little bit, in a way that maybe that wasn't the case when it first came along. What's your take on that whole thing? Is just on a sociological level that, you know, now abduction research stands alone, you know, side by side with UFO research, where before it was sort of on the peripheral of UFOs.
Yeah, well, I mean, I still see the whole thing as so interconnected, but I mean, the issues of sightings, of course, are still, which really was the essential area of investigation many years ago. That's still extraordinarily important, and this is the kind of thing that Leslie Kean has been working on, and her book will deal with. It's not going to deal with abductions or anything like that, but the point is that will continue, and I think that abductions are sort of part of the whole scene. It's hard for me to separate things out, but the point is abductions are the one place where we really have a huge amount of information. What we've learned from sightings in terms of information is very slight. We just got more sightings and more reports of their incredible maneuverability and so forth. But with abductions, for the first time, we learned what this is about and what the inside looks like and what the beings look like and so forth. So it's the source of our real information now.
Yeah. Now let me throw some sort of short point little thoughts at you. What about the whole idea, the conspiracy theory that the government, you know, is in cahoots with the ETs and they allow the abductions to go on and then it got out of hand and all that kind of thing?
Well, I have all kinds of problems with conspiracy theories in general. And, of course, one of the basic rules in conspiracy thinking is to assume that the enemy, whoever it is, in this case we'll say the government, is practically omnipotent, can do what it wants to do. You know, nobody has a conspiracy theory about some foe that's a complete klutz, doing everything wrong and screwing up, like the CIA with the Bay of Pigs and you name all the rest of it. So it seems to me that one of the things, of course, behind the idea of the government being involved in cahoots and all this is that somehow the government is so powerful that they can tell the abductors not to take any more people, and then somehow the abductors renege on the promise. It was, to me, that whole idea is just really foolish. The one thing we do know about the UFO phenomenon for sure is that it can pretty much do what it wants to do.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to have obstacles. It's pretty close to being omnipotent. And the one thing we know about the government is that it isn't omnipotent. It totally screws up. One of the things I always liked was when Eisenhower was elected president, apparently Harry Truman said he's not going to like being president because he's used to the Army. And he said, in the Army, you give a command and it's carried out, and as president, you give a command and nothing happens. But somebody added to that, trouble with Truman is and that remark is that he completely overestimated the efficiency of the Army, which I think is the point.
Yeah.
Things don't happen in the Army that efficiently either. And so I just can't think that there's some sort of high-level connection, and I just can't imagine what that would be about. And, there's no sign anywhere that we have any real great advances in technology thanks to reverse engineering, which I'm sure is going on. But I think reverse engineering is probably tremendously difficult simply because they are so far ahead of us. Like Stan Friedman said, what would General Grant have done during the Civil War if he'd come upon the wreckage of a crashed MiG jet fighter?
Yeah, exactly.
How could he have gotten the thing to go? He wouldn't have known what's the first step. But the point is, part of this was foisted on us by Colonel Corso in a book which is, as far as I'm concerned, one long fantasy by somebody who is just a little man who wanted to give himself attention because, according to his book, he actually saved the world. He saved the planet. And I've gotten into this a long time ago with Corso. The idea to me is that reverse engineering probably started in 1947 at the time of Roswell. And according to Corso, if you believe him, you have to say they didn't do anything. They sat around for something like 17 years until his commanding officer handed him this box of space junk and said, "Here, Corso, see what you could do with this."
Yeah.
And thereupon he saved the world. Well, I mean, reverse engineering, I'm sure the attempts have been made, but the point is that we don't seem to have any great advance. We don't have anything that, we didn't have anything that could locate Osama or any, I don't want to get into this because it's always a place where I get angry.
We don't want you to get angry.
Yeah.
All right. What about the whole alien implant thing? I was surprised. You may have mentioned it, but I don't recall any reference to the alien implant theory in the book. So what's your take on that whole aspect?
I didn't go into that. No, I do think that certainly there are implants, and we have. I mean, I have X-rays of implants inside the heads of two different people in a way they couldn't have been put in place. But the problem is, and despite all the work that's been done in that field, I think that we still don't have an object which meets the criteria of what science would demand, something that could not have been made on Earth.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. Roger Lear's done a lot of work on this, but it's perhaps not something that's final, the smoking gun. But I do believe the implants are put in place regularly.
Before I do what's next for you, I guess, is just the sweeping sort of, what do you think's coming down the line here for the UFO phenomenon and abductions? And do you think we're going to see any sort of answer to all this, at any point?
Well, those are several questions that are interesting. I've always been a bad predictor of the future here. So, as a friend, an old comic said he's been a bad gambler. And he's had a stroke of bad luck ever since he bet on the German army in World War I. So I don't try to predict the future. It's hard to know. Okay. And it will surprise us. The phenomenon will surprise us. I don't like the way it looks like it's heading. Just in terms of these beings on the ground, with us. Yeah. You're running around on Earth, driving cars, whatever. That's kind of scary. So, not knowing what's going to happen in research, it's very, very difficult to nail.
Okay. It's probably a little easier to nail what's next for you. So, so what do we have coming up from Budd Hopkins that people can look forward to? Obviously, you said you've been working on this book for 10, 15 years, so that's magnum opus. But what might be coming up next for you?
Well, I don't foresee another book. That's for sure at this point. Because I'm a little tired of writing these things. I'm still working with abductees, and I'm also trying to train people to take up where I leave off. And I want to spend, of course, more time in the studio working, painting. Mm-hmm. So all of that is what's happening now.
Sounds
but,
good.
At my age, I'm not exactly leaping around and. When you're 2 years short of 80, you get kind of nervous.
I can imagine. Yeah, I'm already not looking forward to my golden years. Now, is there any way that people can? Obviously, they can buy your books and stuff. Is there any way they can buy your art?
Well, there's a company called Levis Fine Arts, and they have been handling my work. I don't know whether he's doing things by email, but I think it's possible. Actually, I could be contacted. The best way is probably a direct contact to me through the website of the Intruders Foundation, and it's just simply Intruders Foundation, one word, .org.
All right, sounds good.
Very
Folks,
easy, and people can contact me, and if they are interested, we can take it from there.
Absolutely, yeah. Not just folks go out and not just get the books, but I would love a Budd Hopkins original. So I'm gonna have to start saving my money here for that. Well, Bud, first of all, thank you for giving us the extra time. We had you slotted for 90 minutes, and we went 2 hours, and I obviously really appreciate that. I know you're a busy guy, and you want to enjoy the fine weather over there at the Cape today. So I really appreciate that you gave us the extra time. I've already thrown a heaping pile of platitudes on you at the introduction, so I don't want to overwhelm you here at the end, but, you're an icon, first ballot Hall of Famer. You set the stage for so much research and really, was one of the founding fathers of a whole branch of esoterica. And, I'm just so happy that you've put together your memoir here, Art, Life, and UFOs from Anomalous Books, and really put it down into words so people in the future can look back and know who Budd Hopkins was and know how he shaped the field in such an amazing way. And I highly recommend people go out and get it and read the whole book, and you'll learn so much about his life. Just an amazing, epic life story. So many incidents and tales and run-ins with famous people that we didn't even get a chance to talk about here this week on the program that you definitely want to find out about in the book. I can't put you over enough, Bud. I'm really happy we finally got a chance to talk and have you here on the program. I look forward to talking to you again in the future. And, you're on the Cape. I'm 20 minutes outside of Boston. Hopefully our paths will cross sooner than later. And I would definitely love to meet you because I have a lot of dog-eared pages in the book that we didn't get to talk about. But once again, thank you so much for coming on the program. You're a living legend, and it was awesome to get a chance to speak with you and talk about not just UFOs, but also your amazing career as an artist as well.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate all of those wonderful things being said again. I'm, again, a tiny bit embarrassed, but I love it anyway. Thank you.
That does it for the penultimate edition of BOA Audio Season 4. Big, super huge thanks, of course, to the amazing Budd Hopkins. Do yourself a favor and pick up his book, Art, Life, and UFOs, a memoir. I'm sure that going into this episode, you already had a great appreciation for Budd Hopkins, but when you read this book, you will see a whole nother side of him. Amazing stuff. Art, Life, and UFOs, a memoir from Anomalous Books. Check it out. And if you want more from Budd Hopkins, check out the Intruders Foundation website, www.intrudersfoundation.org. That's the official Budd Hopkins website. We can find out all sorts of stuff about his abduction research. Moving right along, it's time for the final BOA Audio listener feedback of the season. Originally, I had planned to do just one email, but we had some technical difficulties really close to the end time of the show. We almost had it all together and things went completely haywire and bumped us up quite a bit of time. And then I got a hilarious email, which I've got to include here as the final email of the season. But first, I got one here that came to us all the way from the UK. and I've been sitting on it for quite a while, but it's time to take care of this one from Jim in the UK. Here's what he has to say. I've noticed that you say awesome a lot. I always thought that on a sliding scale of goodness, okay was at one end and awesome was at the other, with cool, wicked, and brilliant somewhere in between. What are you going to say when the aliens land on the White House lawn, or a Yeti pops into a downtown bar for a beer and a pack of Marlboros? LOL. I'm not sure how to read that, so we'll just go with the LOL. From Jim in the UK. I was going to go into this whole thing about the sliding scale of goodness, but you guys already know that I am the master of hyperbole. I don't know what to tell you. Every time I have a guest on, I'm almost always blown away by their stuff, and then the next guest comes along, and I'm even more stunned and amazed by what they're bringing to the table. This is a journey for me as much as it is the listeners, and I'm always excited when I get some compelling and really great stuff, and I tend to go over the top in my pronouncements about how awesome stuff is, but trust me, if it wasn't awesome, I wouldn't say awesome, and a lot of times I don't say awesome, and I leave it up to the discerning BOA audio listeners to figure out really what I'm trying to say between the lines there. Sliding scale of goodness, I don't know what to tell you, buddy, but I do know that if the aliens landed on the White House lawn or a Yeti popped into a downtown bar for a beer and some smokes, there's really only one reaction, and that's holy shit. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to Mag and her children. I shouldn't have sworn just then, but that's just the way it is. At some point, you just got to go to expletives, and that's what you do when you run into the esoteric in real life. Thanks for writing in, Jim. I appreciate it, all the way from the UK. We were going to end the listener feedback there from Jim in the UK, sort of in keeping with our theme and our love for the international listeners, but as I said, this email popped into my inbox literally moments before I sat down to tape this, and I had to read it because it sums up the season almost perfectly. It's short and sweet and 100% accurate. Here's what it is. Showtimes is the title, and just one sentence. All right, Tim, stop pissing around and give us the show, damn it. Signed, Jennifer. No hometown listed, just Jennifer. And, you know, that really sums up the season. I don't know what the hell has been going on with me, folks. I've been really bad about the deadlines here for the episodes this year. Maybe that builds up the anticipation, and we finally got a listener just to outright snap and send us an email. I laughed about it. I wrote her back, told her, you're the final email of the season. Jennifer, congratulations. You really hit me right on the nose with that one. I'm going to make my new season resolution to be more punctual with the show. I know I said that about the final 4 of season 4, and that fell through the cracks pretty quickly, but this time I mean it. We're going to really work hard next season to try and get the episodes out to you on time, and I'm going to really take a look at what's been getting in our way here as we try to get the episodes out to you on time. I apologize, but I'm laughing about it, and I hope the great listeners out there are too. I can't believe somebody finally called me out on the really awful scheduling of the shows at times, and how we pass my self-imposed deadlines constantly. I don't know what's wrong with me. I gotta stop doing these deadlines that I just can't catch. But anyway, new season resolution, Jennifer, I promise we're gonna try and get the episodes out to y'all on a more timely basis. So there you go. Those are the 2 emails. Jim from the UK. Jennifer can't wait any longer. No hometown listed. She wants the show, damn it. Thank you for being the final emails of season 4. You guys are awesome. Just because we're not reading emails at the end of next week's season finale doesn't mean I don't want to hear from you folks out there. If you're interested in having certain guests or certain topics on the show, now is the perfect time to get in touch with me, because really we have a clean slate right now for season 5. I've got a tentative pencil-written list here for season 5, but I want to hear what the listeners think and who they'd like to hear from, as well as what they liked here in season 4. In addition to all the previous seasons. I mean, we're sitting on a massive Rolodex of guests and topics, and I'd love to bring some of these folks back in season 5. So tell me who you want to hear back on the show. Tell me who you want to hear for the first time on the show. And just tell me what you think of the show. You know, I'm interested in feedback from all the awesome BOA audio listeners. How do you get in touch with me? That's simple. There's 3 methods. Chances are you've heard me do this about 1,000 times. Let's try and make it short and sweet. Email boaaudio@hotmail.com, or go to the website BOA and click the contact button. And the third method, it is interactive, the official BOA Forum, the US of E.com, THEUSOFE.com. Those are the three methods. There's a whole bunch of other ways. Facebook, MySpace, Twitter. I'm everywhere. I'm not hard to get a hold of. So now I just turn it over to you, and I look forward to hearing from the awesome BOA Audio listeners. Up next is the thanks portion of the show. You know them, you love them. They are the esteemed and infamous BOA staff. Leslie, Chiron, R. Lee, Joe V., Tina Senna, Rochelle Hawks, Richard Thomas, Lasha Siniuk, and A.M. Murphy. Tons of stuff at BOA in the last week since you heard from me. I'm going to run through the list really, really quickly as best I can. A.M. Murphy's Not Always So, under the title Big Brother and Soror Mystica, all about Aleister Crowley and Carl Jung. Fascinating stuff there. Lasha Siniuk's Field Notes, Me and Chicken Little, We Got Issues. Hilarious title, I love that title. All about astrology and a certain window we're in right now. Troubling stuff, perhaps. Exciting stuff, perhaps. Check that out. Richard's Room 101, also at BOA. It is a text interview with Len Osanek, host of Black Op Radio. Great stuff from Richard, getting Len's opinion on a whole bunch of different JFK-related avenues of discussion. Then it was Regan Lee's Trickster's Realm from earlier this week. UFOs in TV, backwards in time from Mr. Monk to Barney Miller. Really, really insightful stuff from Regan Lee, looking at the latest episode of Monk titled Mr. Monk and the UFO. Fun episode of Monk. I liked it, even though it was kind of anti-UFO, but Regan dissects it, and then looks back to a classic episode of Barney Miller, which was actually pro-UFO. So things aren't always that bad with UFOs in TV. Wrapping it all up, Leslie's Gray Matters, titled this week 40 and Felines, sadly talking about the loss of Leslie's cat, James Bond, and some of the more spooky incidents that have happened since James Bond passed away. It's kind of a sad edition of Gray Matters, but definitely uplifting as well, and one you want to check out. So there is 5 new columns from BOA dealing with a huge range of stuff. If you're only listening to BOA Audio and you're not reading the columns at Banal of America, as I just showed you, you're really only getting half the story. BOA, make it a part of your everyday search for esoteric news and opinion. There's a financial crisis. It's been going on since the start of Season 4. I feel bad asking for money at the end of every episode, but it's something I gotta do. This thing costs me money. We produce a ton of episodes for you every year. The phone bills are huge, and the bandwidth bills are huge. And as we're closing out Season 4, we're kind of in the red a little bit, and we'd like to get the show in the black and have a little bit of a nest egg to keep us going through the leaner months as the year goes on during Season 5. Why am I telling you all this? Because I turn to you great folks who are listening to the program to help us out. Please, please, please make a donation to Banal of America and BOA Audio. We would really appreciate it. How do you do that? Simple. You go to BOA and click the PayPal button. You can find it on the home page or the BOA Audio archive page. Click that. They'll walk you through the process at PayPal. It's wicked simple. Anyone could do it. I hope you can do it, and I hope you donate to us. We'd really appreciate it. And obviously, all donations go towards Banal of America and BOA Audio, keeping the program, the podcast, the website, all that stuff up and running, freely available, and commercial-free for all of our great readers and listeners the world over. You already know what's going on next week. First, I'll give you the heads up. It may be about 10 days until you hear the season finale. I want to put together a little musical closer there for the season like we've done the last few years. So stick around towards the middle of next week for that, and then probably another 4 or 5 days after that you'll hear the season finale. Trust me, though, it is worth the wait. Why? Because we're closing the book on Season 4 with one of the biggest interviews in the history of the program. Our guest is one of the more enigmatic, infamous, and legendary figures in the history of UFO studies, John Lear. This is an ultra-rare 2-hour conversation. We're going to be covering a ton of stuff. I'm going to run through the list for you really quick, and I'm probably going to lose my voice by the time I'm done reading it. Point by point, just a scratch at the surface of what we're going to be talking about with John Lear. Paul Benowitz, Bill Cooper, Bill Moore, 1980s ufology. The 1989 MUFON convention in Las Vegas. stuff from the 1987 Lear document that was posted to the internet and around ufology that blew a lot of minds at the time. The alien spaceship that allegedly crashed and was buried because it was too big to move. The concept of souls and reincarnation and how the aliens may fit into all this. The incident at the Dulce base between an ET and the Army. Human mutilations, UFO disclosure, and the odds of it ever actually happening. Bizarre things on the moon. The secret space program, undersea connections between the western half of the United States, John's theory on 9/11 that the planes were holograms and the towers were felled via space weapons, Bob Lazar and the Area 51 story, the state of ufology today, exopolitics, why the mainstream branches of esoterica seem to be quite different from where John's going with a lot of his theories, George Knapp, Art Bell, why ufology isn't a team sport, and a shitload more stuff. As you could just tell, we run the gamut of esoterica in this conversation, and trust me, just about everything John Lear has to say is pretty remarkable stuff. I know to a lot of newcomers in esoterica, John Lear is kind of this mythical and mysterious figure, and a lot of people just quickly dismiss John's stuff because it's so outrageous at times, and they forget that he had this tremendous impact on the field of ufology in the 1980s. Both Art Bell and George Knapp have credited him with planting the seed for their future exploits, exploring the unknown, and as most people know, John Lear was side by side with Bob Lazar as one of the godfathers of Area 51. This guy is someone who forever altered the landscape of esoterica and ufology. So much of what you see and hear in the world of UFO studies today has John Lear's fingerprints all over it. It's definitely a must-hear episode of BOA Audio. It's the season finale of Season 4 with the enigmatic and infamous John Lear. And on that note, we close the book here on the penultimate episode. Thank you, folks, for your patience in waiting for this episode. This is why we don't do the show usually in the summer. This is why we've stopped every year around the beginning of July, because I got a lot going on here in the summer. It's tough to do a podcast and do my other life work. But we're getting it together here, and we got one more episode for you, obviously. And I want to thank you all for being so patient. I really appreciate it. The BOA Audio listeners are awesome. You guys really are the fuel that drives the machine. We are a grassroots program, and you guys are the grassroots. I'll be babbling like a moron on the season finale episode anyway, thanking everybody. So let's just close out the episode now so I can save things up and get it out to you as soon as possible. Until next time, this is Tim Banal, thanking you for listening and signing off.